Great. Thank you for your help. My name is Kat. I'm a senior design and developer advocate for Progress Software, and I have spent my career focused on the front end. After taking a somewhat meandering path through design and into development, I eventually kind of found my niche in the world of component libraries and design systems, where those two worlds overlap, and I've been working there very happily ever since. That design background has made me especially interested in the user experience side of software engineering. And one of the things that I have come to realize is that we are wrong. Like, a lot. At least I certainly am. And I suppose I don't know all of y'all just yet, but I feel pretty confident in saying that you get things wrong too. And to be clear, I'm not just talking about typos or code mistakes here. I'm talking about the stuff that's a little bit bigger than a dropped semicolon. I mean the actual things that we're building, how users interact with it, what they're supposed to do with it. As we start to see more and more of the craft of writing code getting automated away in the age of AI, these bigger questions of what actual problem we're solving and how we're doing it are becoming more and more integral to our roles as software developers. Now, I hope you don't take it too personally when I say that you're wrong, because I don't mean it as any kind of moral judgment. I do actually genuinely believe that all of us here in this room are good at our jobs. After all, you took the time to come here, you're attending this conference, you're clearly interested in learning and improving your skill set. But we can be dedicated and we can truly want to build something useful, and we can still make mistakes and get things wrong. We can still create things that aren't suited for the people using them, things that cause unintentional harm, or things that just straight up don't solve the problem that we wanted them to solve. Often this happens because we are making decisions without the correct information. We're letting our assumptions lay the foundation for our software, either intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes we know that we don't have all the information and we just have to make a choice to the best of our ability with the limited context that we do have. But other times, we may not even be realizing that we have actively made a choice. Our assumptions biased the outcome of what we were working on without our conscious knowledge. Now, assumptions can be useful. Our brains make them as a way of kind of creating shortcuts and working faster. And most of the time, that is a helpful thing. It's what allows us to notice patterns and respond to them. And it's important to know that our users are going to be doing the same thing when they interact with what we've built. Making assumptions is just part of how human brains work. But that does not mean that our assumptions are always going to be correct. Learning how to identify and push past those assumptions and biases are going to help us become better developers. This is, again, especially important right now, because when an app prototype can be AI generated in minutes, there are hundreds of tiny UX decisions that we used to have to make that are now getting automatically defaulted to whatever gets generated, which is often just the average of whatever the model was trained on. And if we're not going to have to make each one of those decisions, then we better start getting really darn good at identifying and reviewing them, and getting comfortable pushing back on places where the default answer is not the right one. An experienced developer's oversight of what is being built has become more crucial than ever. So today, we are going to talk through some very common but wrong things that we assume about our users. Then we're going to look at some techniques that you can use to help question the assumptions you might be making and catch the wrong ones, ideally before you ship, and sometimes before you write even a single line of code. Assumption 1. My users each have exactly one full name assigned at birth. Let's start with an easy one. And yet, I will tell you, as someone who has a double-barrel, non-hyphenated last name, Grayson Nanz, it is clearly not as obvious as one might think. We make a ton of assumptions about our users' names. And in fact, if you have not yet seen the famous falsehoods that programmers believe about names, now is your chance. I'll even tell you, there's about 40 of these, and they don't all fit on the slide. Suffice it to say, we get names wrong, like all the time. We tend to assume that names will be 2 or 3 words, that they'll be only comprised of letters, that they're going to be a permanent designation, a unique designation for our users. And these things are simply untrue. For example, names do not always have the exact structure that we imagine. Married or combined family names might give someone 4 or 5 parts to their name instead of that first, middle, last structure that we tend to assume. There are also hyphenated names, cultural names, nicknames, names that lead with a family name instead of a given name, legal names that don't match preferred names, names that include special characters, including and beyond just hyphens, and many, many more. Even once we have a name field that can accommodate all those possibilities, the user still needs to be able to update their name. It's easy to make the mistake of thinking of a user's name as some kind of UUID, but that is not true. Both preferred and legal names will change for a variety of reasons, including, but not limited to, marriage, divorce, transition, adoption, or just normal life changes in identity. So to throw myself out there as an example again, when I was a kid, I was Katie. In my teens and 20s, that turned into Kathryn. Now, as it turns out, working with a group of people that really like nicknames, and Kat has really started to stick. For me, none of those were legal name changes, although I did have one of those as well when I got married. But each time that changed, it changed the way that I wanted to be addressed, both in person and by the user interfaces and services that I signed up for. I know people who prefer to use a nickname with friends or a full name at work, or on the flip side, people like myself who have taken a nickname at work to help differentiate a situation, right? Maybe you share a name with lots of other people. Maybe you were Jonathan your whole life, and now you're John because you joined a team where there's already 2 Jonathans. Maybe you work with a team like mine where nicknames are a cultural thing, and they actually feel kind of uncomfortable calling you by your full name all the time like you're in trouble. Names are weird, and they are 100% not permanent. Now, the consequences for messing this up can range from mild to not so mild, right? On the kind of lightly annoying end for me, my weird and self-inflicted last name means that I cannot search for things like plane tickets or hotel reservations based on my last name, because I have no idea how it has been normalized into their database. Was it saved correctly, the way I typed it in? Or was it saved with an incorrect hyphen, with no space between Grayson and Nanz, as just Grayson, as just Nanz, combined but cut short due to a character limit, or often some increasingly bizarre and creative combination of all of those options? As a front-end engineer, you'd think I would have thought about this before I got married and changed my name, but no such luck. Now, on the more serious end, you could be causing more emotional harm by dead naming someone or by addressing them as a name that connects them to a past harmful relationship. You could also be causing physical harm by subjecting them to things like extra security screenings at airports or locking them out of events because their ticket names don't match their legal name. This is especially true if you're working in healthcare, banking, or transportation, where user identity is often regularly confirmed by checking against a government ID. If what's in your app does not match what's on their ID, there's probably going to be problems. Assumption 2, my users can read the user interface. And I promise this is more than just a series of jokes about how we can't get users to read what we write. Again, it feels obvious, right? Of course, my users can read. They may be choosing not to, but they're capable of it, right? To be fair, yeah, they probably can. But they may not actually be fluent in all the ways that you're imagining. What we're assuming here is that our users can read English, or whatever language your app is in, if you're not offering full internationalization. Even if they are fluent in English, for example, maybe as a second language, does the copy in your interface include abbreviations, jokes, cultural references, idioms, or other things that may get lost in translation? If you've ever had to collaborate with an international team, then you also know just how much can slip through the cracks. A few weeks ago, as I was telling a story earlier at this conference, one of my Bulgarian colleagues was complaining about a project that she got roped into and how hard it was, and then laughed it off by saying that she had put the hedgehog in her own pants. Come again? Turns out that is, in fact, a Bulgarian idiom to mean knowingly taking on a difficult situation, especially one that might have been avoided.
That's amazing.
And to be honest, if there's any one thing you take away from this talk, I kind of hope that it's this. I kind of hope this enters your vocabulary forever, the way that it has mine. But yes, while it was, in fact, a very apt description of this project, it was completely meaningless to me until she laughingly explained it. Without her to serve as translator, however, I would have been entirely lost and very curious about her strange hobbies. Another thing we often don't take into account is reading level. According to the National Literacy Institute, as of 2025, 54% of adults in the United States have a literacy level below the 6th grade. 20% are below the 5th grade. However, your instructions, error messages, documentation, legal copy, and more are often written far above that. That means that, depending on just how careful you are being about your copywriting, up to half of your users may not actually be understanding what your app is asking, instructing, or telling them. This is especially true, again, if you're dealing with industry-specific jargon. That could be terms that they're unfamiliar with, it could be acronyms they've never encountered, or other kinds of highly specific language. If you have ever had to work through hospital bills or medical paperwork, then you know the struggle. It's important to remember that just because it's familiar to us does not mean that it is familiar to them. In addition to literal language comprehension, there's also a different kind of literacy, interface literacy. Gen Z often gets referred to as being digital natives because they grew up alongside computers and tablets and smartphones. They have never lived without them, and it gives them a kind of native speaker understanding of how user interfaces work. That includes things like recognizing standard icon associations, gesture and click patterns, common user flows, all sorts of things that make them fluent in the language of user interfaces. If you have ever watched a toddler use a tablet, then you know what this looks like, because it is astounding how quickly they learn to switch between apps, skip ads on their YouTube videos, change out of whatever you set them to do, and suddenly start looking up strange things in the browser. It can be a real challenge to identify the things that could be stumbling blocks for our older or less tech-literate users who aren't quite so familiar, but it's important for us to try to step back out of our own understanding of these kinds of interfaces and think about how they might look to someone who doesn't use them all the time. Assumption 3, my users are choosing to be here. One of the most common incorrect assumptions that I hear is that using software is optional. If the experience is bad enough, users can just leave, right? They can take their business to a competitor. They don't have to be here. However, that is frequently not true, at the very least not as often as our users may wish that it was. A few categories of situations where our users have no real choice include things like workplace software. Please feel free to raise your hands if you also hate Microsoft Teams. Yeah. Every now and again, I get that pop-up that's like, how likely are you to recommend Microsoft 365 to a friend? Like, first off, what are you talking about? That's not what me and my friends talk about. And even if it was, I don't think I would recommend Teams to anyone I was not trying to exact vengeance upon. Apologies if there are any Teams devs here in the room. But often, employers choose the software and employees are stuck with it. Many of us are developing that kind of enterprise software, even if it's not Microsoft Teams. And I'm not always sure that we would recommend everything that we build to a friend. Users may also not have a choice if the software is related to government or utility, other kinds of large systems that they have to interact with. If you're doing something like applying for benefits or renewing your driver's license, then you quite literally don't have another option. You have to use the official government-provided application. Which drives me nuts because I will tell you, at least in North Carolina, the application to renew your license or pay your vehicle tax is formatted like a chat box that asks you one question at a time and takes you forever to interact with. Every time I do it, I wish it was a form, and I think about how I would be done already if it was a form. But the only alternate option is to go to an office, fill out the paperwork in person. Maybe, if you have access to a car or childcare or time off work. And even if you do have those things, you might still prefer a terrible user interface over an hour at the DMV. I will tell you that I do. The same may also be true for things like your utility provider. So let's say I want the lights to stay on in my house. I get to choose between giving my money to Duke Energy or, that's right, Duke Energy. Even if we did have another option, we don't make the selection based off the UI of an application, right? If I'm choosing which hospital I want to have surgery at, I'm looking at the doctors and their experience and their familiarity with my condition. But I'm still going to have to deal with the hospital's software if I want to do things like view my charts or pay my bills. Finally, even if a user did choose to use your software initially, and even if they could technically change to something better, they may still feel locked in by their data, their subscriptions, or just their habits. We saw that pretty recently, right, when a bunch of people struggled to leave Twitter as it became X. There were arguably similar alternatives out there, perhaps too many similar alternatives out there. But a lot of folks had built up their network and their community on Twitter, and they had a very hard time saying goodbye to that. Choosing once is not always the same as choosing to stay. Assumption 4, my users will use the user interface. Again, seems fair, right? I made a button with the express intent of the users clicking that button. Whether that happens from a mouse or a trackpad or the tap of a touchscreen, it's pretty safe to assume my users are going to be directly interacting with my software in order to use it, right? When in fact, that's not always the case. In fact, a great deal of web browsing and software interaction is done with an additional intermediate factor between the user and the interface. There are kind of two main situations where we see this happen. The first is accessibility-related situations. Not all of your users can even see your user interface. They might be hearing it instead from a screen reader or maybe the narration of another person who's helping them navigate. Even if they can see the app themselves, they might be interacting with it via alternate input methods like adaptive switches or eye tracking devices or voice control. They're not necessarily going to be scrolling with a mouse, typing with a keyboard, or touch tapping the way that you assumed when you built that interface. However, the interface will still need to work. The other option is a somewhat newer one, but perhaps that makes it all the more relevant. As people increasingly use AI agents or assistants to do things for them, your interface may not ever be seen by a human being at all. Instead, maybe it's being navigated by a bot that's never going to perceive it with eyes the way that a human does. If your UI is relying on visual context or it includes complicated interaction patterns, something like a CAPTCHA or other kinds of user verification or just non-standard components, it may break entirely the minute that there's not a human actively involved. Assumption 5, software and the internet is not the real world. Please note, I did put the matrix slide in here specifically for this. One of the most dangerous assumptions that we can make is that software is somehow completely differentiated from real life. It's just an app, it's just pixels on a screen, it's low stakes by default. It's common to hear developers jokingly say things like, this isn't a hospital, we're not saving lives here. And yeah, there's some truth in that, right? Like, hopefully it's not a life or death situation. But this also isn't a one or the other kind of thing, where just because it's not life or death doesn't mean it's not important. True, like, we're not doctors in an ER, but what we're doing still does have real impact on people's lives. Now more than ever, software is the real world, and the consequences of getting it wrong are real consequences. I think by now, probably many of us are familiar with fellow developer Eric's story and with his daughter Rebecca, the name that inspired the CSS color Rebecca Purple. On his blog, he tells the story of being greeted by a very cheery Your Year in Review graphic on Facebook, auto-generated with a photo of his recently deceased daughter. That was just a silly feature in a social media app, but it still caused very real pain. Or as he put it, I didn't go looking for grief this afternoon, but it found me anyway. and I have designers and programmers to thank for it. The same is true when our interface misgenders someone, delivers bad news like it's good news, or many other things that we simply didn't think of because we incorrectly assumed that our content would always be viewed in a positive context. In addition to emotional harm, our apps can cause material harm as well. If an individual can't navigate their benefits application, for example, they may not get the resources that they need. And we saw that actually happen not that long ago during COVID, when millions of suddenly jobless folks in the US were unable to complete unemployment benefit applications online. And of course, during that time, there was no other option to just go fill out the paperwork in an office. If you couldn't do it online, you couldn't do it at all. So thousands and thousands of people across the states went without benefits that were rightfully theirs during an incredibly challenging time, all because of a software failure. Or, to offer one more real-world example, when the false missile alert caused widespread panic in Hawaii and beyond because somebody misclicked a very clearly confusing drop-down. People were calling their loved ones, making arrangements, saying goodbye. The chaos that both of these situations caused was not mitigated just because they happened on a computer. Now, the point of those examples was not just to make us feel sad or guilty or like bad developers. The point was to show just how easy it is to make an incorrect assumption and let mistakes like that sneak through. In fact, I would say that some amount of this kind of thing is perhaps unavoidable in the first version of any piece of software. And we kind of even know that from a tech perspective, right? Even when we try our best and we work with care and we pay attention to the details, we're still going to see bugs and errors in the first version of something. That's why we have steps built into our processes to help catch them, ideally, before they get to our users. We have things like PR reviews, we have unit tests, we have QA, we have visual regression, we do beta releases, right? We acknowledge making mistakes is an inevitable part of the process. And so we start building in steps to counteract it. That's what lets us figure out how to be wrong, but better. The same thing goes for these kinds of UX mistakes. So in the second half of this talk, we're going to kind of pivot and go through some of the things we can build into our processes on the UX side to help catch these assumptions before they get baked into our software. Now, of course, one of the best things that you can do is user research. Conduct user interviews, run usability tests, hold focus groups, write surveys, put together a customer advisory board. You have a lot of options here. The best way to learn about your users is to talk to them. But I don't want to get too far into that today because that's a whole other talk. No, really, that's a whole other talk that I've actually given before. It's also a course that I wrote for O'Reilly. So if you want a little bit more on the specifics about how to run usability tests, including what to test, how to find your users, how much budget you need, these things may be of interest to you. You can get the kind of high-level overview, courtesy of a past Stir Trek, in fact. Or you can go a little bit deeper with the course. Weird self-promotion section over. Thank you. However, let's make the assumption that you don't necessarily want to involve your users yet, for whatever reason. Could be budget, although I bet you can do more than you think more than you might think with less money. It could be time. It could be that you're still kind of figuring out your product market fit. You have not actually identified your audience yet. It could be that this software is still just an idea in your head. Maybe you don't even have users to talk to. And honestly, even if you do have the time, the budget, the UX professionals even to do this for you, these kind of techniques are still good things to build into your process because they can help you catch bigger mistakes earlier. If you can identify an issue before you even put it into a prototype and set it in front of a user, then you're one step ahead. That user can now spend their limited time with you identifying more complex, less obvious problems instead of getting stuck immediately on something that you potentially should have caught yourself. Ideally, these are techniques that you're going to want to employ pretty early in the process, preferably before you started building anything, but it's not a bad idea to revisit them when you're adding new features or reworking the user flow in an established application. There's an approach that designers are taught called the 5 whys. It is used to help push you past superficial problem statements to identify the root cause of an issue. That way, when you're designing a solution, you are actually working to address the cause and not the symptom. Sometimes design techniques can feel weird to developers. Sometimes just the word design kind of gets their hackles up a little bit. There's a joke among Dungeons & Dragons players that as soon as a DM says, "You enter a dark room," all the players who have the dark vision capability immediately are compelled to say, "But I can see, I have dark vision." I've noticed a very similar impulse among developers who hear the word design and immediately want to tell me that they cannot draw, not even stick figures, I promise. The good news about this particular design technique, though, is that it does not take any art-related aptitude whatsoever. You just have to be able to channel your inner toddler. The basic concept is this. You will start by defining a problem statement, which is one sentence that defines the problem you're attempting to solve. So let's say, for example, it's hard to call an Uber during rush hour. Then we ask why. We ask why 5 times in a row. Why can't I call the cab? Well, lots of other people are trying to do the same thing. I can't seem to get through. Why can't I get through? Well, Uber drivers prefer established riders with high star ratings. Why do they prefer those? Those users have proven themselves to be reliable. They tip highly. Why does the tipping change anything? Because Uber rewards high tippers. They reward regular users and users who don't cancel rides, so on and so forth. From this, we've already identified our problem doesn't actually have much to do with rush hour, right? The way our problem statement may have led us to believe. It probably has more to do with the way Uber computes their rankings and shows them to drivers. So if I'm a new Uber rider and I have no star ranking at all, or I had to cancel a ride through no fault of my own, it could be having a negative impact on my user experience within the app that doesn't have much to do with how busy it is at the time. That's actually the problem that we need to be solving around. That's it. That's the whole technique. I knew you could do it. You don't even have to restrict this to problem statements, though. You can do it with any old sentence that you hear somebody say that sounds a little bit wrong. So if you hear people say things like, well, people don't have to use my software, you can say, why? And kind of help tease out the assumptions that might be fueling that statement. Sometimes you don't even need to go through all 5 of the whys before you kind of produce a statement that feels more identifiably wrong, right? In our Uber example, I don't know how many of you were keeping count, but we technically only asked why 4 times before we identified the other compounding factors. You can just keep going until you feel like you hit that because I said so point, like your parents did. And what happens when you get a why that you can't answer? That's actually one of the best outcomes because it shows where we have knowledge gaps. The next step there, of course, is to conduct some user research, aka do some Googling, or check your own research database if you have one, and see if you can find the answer. Extreme personas. Now, generally, the goal of a UX persona is to capture a kind of high-level description of the types of users who are going to regularly interact with your product. However, an effective and fun way to kind of edge test your product or idea is to create an extreme character persona and see how they would interact with your product. How would Darth Vader call an Uber? How would Barbie save a document? How would Homer Simpson search for movie times? So on and so forth. Of course, you do not have to use trademarked and established characters from fiction or media. You can come up with your own, or you can rely on tropes, like the actually guy who always has to correct you and has more of a statement than a question, or the sweet grandma who is always losing her phone. The goal here is just to push yourself beyond those kind of traditional personas into something that will help you think outside the box. You probably have a whole pack of user behavior assumptions you would automatically apply to young male professional 20 to 25 years old. But you probably have less of those assumptions that you carry over into a supervillain, an 8-year-old child, or Cher from Clueless, because those are not people that we typically imagine using our applications. This exercise will work best when your character has strongly defined traits that will help you stress test specific assumptions. So your high-pressure executive girl boss persona with no time for anything is going to help you stress test your onboarding flow, how easy it is to get up and going quickly. Your Secret Service 007 agent persona trying to keep a low profile will help you identify blockers related to data collection, where you may be collecting more than you actually need. And your non-technical sweet little grandma, of course, will help you catch interface literacy assumptions. As with all personas, both normal and extreme, they also become a really good way to communicate complex ideas quickly within your team, kind of establishing a shared language. So you can be in a meeting and say, yeah, but wouldn't that trip up grandma? And that becomes a question that everyone understands, an approach that they know, and a quick way to kind of double check ideas, because everyone is already on the same page with exactly what that means. Mind mapping. Probably not a new idea for many of you, so I'm not going to spend too much time explaining the core concept, which is basically you put one item in the center of a page, draw a circle around it, and branch off it with related ideas, which in turn you can also branch off to create steps of interconnected concepts that all lead back to your main idea. For this technique, though, we're going to use this mind mapping structure to explore user interactions for your application. So you're going to start with your app or feature in the center of the page, and then draw 6 branches off of that central point. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Then you'll branch off each of those with more information about your users and how they're going to use what you're building. So who will probably be your primary personas, right? Not the extreme ones, but the people who actually use your app. What will they use your app for? How often will they use it? When will they reach for it? Where will they be when they do? Why would they need it? The first few things that you come up with are probably going to be what's called the happy path, or the ideal situation and context in which your users are interacting with what you made when everything is going right in their lives. Those are the easiest things to think of, but it's still important to write them down, if only to get them out of your brain so that you can kind of push further past them. Then, and this is the important part, you want to keep going, perhaps even beyond what you think is realistic, into things that might feel like kind of a stretch. Where are they using your app? Sure, at the desk in their office, at their couch at home, maybe laying in bed in a hotel room, maybe laying on a towel at the beach, maybe in a car while parked, maybe in a car as the passenger, maybe in a car as the driver, in an airport, in an airplane, with no internet, who knows, right? Some of these are hopefully less likely to be true, like the car driver, but they're still going to kind of shake loose ideas or make you think about your user interactions in a new way. Because sure, maybe your users are not opening the app while they're driving, but they may be in other situations where they're distracted or where they only have one hand available. They may not actually be using it on an airplane mid-flight, but maybe they need to access the information in your app in other situations where an internet connection isn't available, like a movie theater at a conference. Then, of course, you're going to start combining the different use cases from across your mind map. What is a teenage user trying to do in your app on an airplane? Is it difficult from what your executive user is doing with your software when they're working from a hotel room, right? You can kind of start to imagine all these various contexts in which your app might be used. And it's helpful for reminding us of all the different ways that our app fits into our users' daily lives. Very few pieces of software now are exclusively used by office workers sitting at a desk. So how can we make sure that what we're building meets our users where they are, both literally and metaphorically? This is a great one to do as a team, mostly because it's more fun. You can kind of bounce off each other with new ideas, right? After all, one person's absurd, no way kind of answer is another person's Tuesday afternoon. Different people on the team are all going to have different blind spots, so working as a group will help you catch a wide array of various possibilities. Next, online ethnography. Ethnography comes from anthropology. It is the practice of studying people by observing them in their natural environment, rather than taking them aside, out of that environment, and asking them questions directly. The idea behind it is that people will behave and answer differently when they know they are being observed, and that may be preventing us from getting an honest and accurate picture of the situation. One of the most commonly stated barriers to conducting user interviews or testing with specific subsets of users is that it's hard to recruit or reach them. And that's fair, it's true. But that does not absolve us from considering what those users need in the things that we're building. A great way to learn about our users without necessarily having to pull them aside and ask them directly is to read what they're sharing online. Online ethnography is really just a fancy way of saying consume online content created by your target demographic. Now, before we get too deep into this, it does come with a very important asterisk, and that is only looking at public-facing groups and not joining anything that is a closed system that requires you to lie about your identity. So for example, if a local group exists for parents, it includes things in the account creation like asking how old your children are. Do not make up a fake child and a fake age for them. It feels obvious, but we do have to say it. This is not meant to be some kind of undercover spy activity, so please don't treat it that way. Instead, you're going to look for posts in public spaces, like subreddits, forums, or open Discord servers. You could follow content creators who self-identify as part of this specific group, or you could read comments on blogs or platforms related to what you're learning about. Just remember, you are a polite visitor there to observe and learn. You are not there to share your own opinion, to ask questions unless you are specifically invited, or to otherwise interrupt the space that you're in. To use the internet words for this, you are a lurker. You are not a poster. Now, what you're looking for here are things like the language that people use to describe their own problems, the frustrations that they express around the currently existing tools, the kinds of workarounds that they've invented to deal with shortcomings, their common pain points, the recurring questions. Let's say that you are building a tool for nurses, maybe a charting system, but you yourself are not a nurse and you don't have any nurse friends that you can go pester. If you spend even just a couple of hours reading the top posts in the nursing subreddit, not only will you be highly entertained, but you will learn things about their daily lived experience that are not going to show up in a JIRA ticket. Finally, rewording. How would you define your problem if you could not use any of the words currently in that sentence? And before anyone gets very pedantic, I don't mean and or the or other structural elements. I mean the description words. This is valuable because our words have common associations. So if I say something like chair, you probably have a fairly specific image in your mind. We might all be imagining different styles of chairs, sure, but most folks are probably imagining something with legs and a seat and a back. Maybe there's armrests. You get the gist. But if instead of chair, I said a place to sit, now some folks will imagine couches or beds or benches or stools. There's all sorts of things you can sit on if you're creative enough. This exercise helps us figure out whether we are using the words that are actually the most accurate or whether we're just kind of reaching for our own defaults and therefore making assumptions and mental jumps that may not actually align with our goals. Words carry all sorts of embedded assumptions, and the words that you reach for first are probably the ones that are closest to your own experience and frame of reference. You may also be making all kinds of assumptions before you even get to the part where you're picking words, right? If you had kind of personally been imagining a chair the whole time, you might have ruled out the option for sofas or benches before you even wrote the problem statement. By forcing yourself to use different descriptive language, let me try that again. Why is this happening? Stop. By forcing yourself to use different descriptive language, you can expose those defaults and force yourself to think outside the box a little bit. Now, this is all feeling a little bit abstract with all the furniture, so let's talk about something software related. Let's rework the statement, the user must log in, without using the words user must or log in. Tell me what you get. I'll give us a couple seconds to try it out yourself. This is an actual interactive thing, so raise your hand when you've got one that you think might be a better fit. Yeah.
Authenticate access.
Okay, good. Authenticate access. Yep.
You need this person to prove who they are.
We need this person to prove who they are. That is a good one. Any others? It's okay if no. So the one that I came up with for this was actually pretty similar. I had a person must prove they're allowed to be here, which again, as we saw, certainly not the only way to have reworked this, but already these expand our options quite a bit, right? Because maybe what we needed was just to check system requirements before they downloaded our software. Maybe we needed to do a location check to make sure we support their country. Maybe this is internal software and we needed to scan a badge or validate with some other kind of system level setting. If the user is connected to the office network, maybe we don't need them to log into the VPN. An actual login may not be the solution that we're looking for, but we kind of defaulted to it because user validation is such a super common flow. By expanding our view, we were able to come up with alternates that may actually be a better solution to our core problem. Now, it'd be really nice if I could promise you that these things will ensure that you're never ever going to be wrong again, right? But being wrong isn't a failure of intelligence or of dedication. And to go back to some of our disastrous examples from the beginning, right? The developers that built the broken unemployment portals were not bad people. They were just also experiencing a world pandemic and under a ton of pressure. The team that shipped the Hawaii missile alert UI were not sitting there like deviously rubbing their hands together like supervillains trying to cause harm. They just didn't know what they didn't know. The goal here isn't to never be wrong, right? Being wrong actually teaches us a lot. Failure is a crucial part of iteration and learning. Instead, our goal is to be wrong earlier while we can still catch and correct it. The exercises and the techniques that we talked about in the second half of this talk are what help us do that. For each incorrect thing that we discover using those approaches, we get to learn something new about our users and our software. Both the wrongness and the discovery are essential parts of the process. As many of you probably knew, I named this talk after Marie Kondo's The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, because I think the core idea is kind of the same. Marie Kondo was not advocating for you to purge everything that you own, right, to live in an empty house. Instead, she was inviting you to look at each item and make an intentional decision about what to keep and what to let go of. And that's all we're trying to do here. We're going to hold up each assumption that we have made about our users and make an intentional decision about whether it is actually the right fit for our product or not. Some of them will be, and we should keep them. The more we work, the more we learn about our users, and the more correct our assumptions get. But some of them are not serving us or our end users, and we need to set them down to prevent unintentionally doing harm. Again, our aim is not to never be wrong, because that's impossible. It's to identify where we are wrong faster and earlier while it's cheaper to correct, and ideally, before another human has to actually experience the consequences. It's how, in an age of automation and increasing speed, we as developers can take an active role in thoughtfully building better software for everyone. Thank you all for listening. If you are interested in the slides or a full transcript of this talk, you can find them here. And I may even have a little time for questions.